Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, and welcome to audio article number 48. Today's audio article, titled 2D versus 3D, was written by Soren Johnson. Mr. Johnson hails from Centralia, a picturesque Washington town with a name straight out of any Richard Garriott RPG. He has a bachelor degree in history and a master's degree in computer science from Stanford University, as well as a soft spot in his heart for furry four-legged feline creatures. He proudly co-designed Civilization 3, as well as coding the AI and the game itself. From there he went on as a project lead and lead designer for Civilization 4. The latest of his long list of mind-blowing credits is working as a designer and programmer on Spore at EA Maxis. To open the door into the mind of this superstar of the gaming industry, head over to www.designer-notes.com to keep up to date with his latest articles, rants, as well as random musings. Audio article number 48, 2D versus 3D, written by Soren Johnson and read aloud by Ryan Wienko on the 27th of December, 2008. This audio article was also published in the June-July 2008 issue of Game Developer magazine. The industry's first video games, Pong, Asteroid, Space Invaders, were all 2D by necessity. A few early games experimented with basic 3D, such as Battlezone's vector-based tank simulator, but these games were simply interesting footnotes, not to the mainstream. Everything changed in 1992 with id Software's Wolfenstein 3D, which popularized 3D as the leading edge of game development. Since then, almost no corner of this industry has been left untouched by the transition from 2D to 3D graphics. Almost every franchise, from Mario to Zelda to even Pac-Man himself, has been tried out on 3D technology. Now that this transition is essentially complete, it may finally be a good time to ask ourselves what we have learned in the process. What are the advantages of 3D and what are its challenges? For what is 2D still the best? Perhaps game developers can now at least choose the best graphics environment on a game-by-game basis, instead of making the move to 3D just from competitive pressure. Troubles with cameras. 3D games and cameras have a long and troubled history. While first-person shooter games are essentially a solved problem for 3D, most other genres are still adapting to the new technology. Teaching the player how to use a camera while also teaching the game's core experience can be a tough challenge. One distinct advantage that 2D games have is the easiest camera to teach us is the one that doesn't exist. In fact, 3D games have been trending away from giving the player extensive camera controls. Super Mario 64 is credited with being the first successful 3D platformer, but it required the player to make extensive use of camera controls to keep Mario visible and heading in the right direction. Platformers attempted more intelligent camera systems over the years, trying to dynamically determine the best perspective at any given time. Such solutions, however, are bound to fail at some point, such as when the character gets stuck behind a corner or under a ledge. To quickly solve this sticky problem, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time introduced two alternative static camera perspectives that the player could access at any time. God of War took this approach a step further and enforced a single fixed camera for each of the game's scenes, approaching the level design almost like a film cinematographer. Super Mario Galaxy has a dynamic camera without any controls whatsoever, although it adapts a nearly top-down view to enable the player to see everything in the surrounding area. Other avatar-based games, such as World of Warcraft, prevent the player from tweaking the camera while moving, ensuring that the player can never end up running directly into the camera. Strategy games have also gone through a progression of camera systems, similarly trending towards taking camera control away from the player, or at least hiding them from the novice. Star Wars Force Commander, one of the first 3D RTS games, had an infamously difficult free camera, which made finding the right angle to view your troops a constant chore. Warcraft 3 may be considered the first RTS to get 3D right. The designers achieved this feat by greatly restricting the camera's freedom. The zoom range was minuscule, and the pitch angle came directly from the zoom. And the only camera rotation was attached to an obscure hotkey. Lead designer Rob Pardo describes the process behind these restrictions. With 3D we decided to bring the camera down quite a bit and try some things out. The problem was that the camera pulled all the way down. It became a pseudo third-person experience. It was disorienting when you wanted to go around the map, and it was difficult to select units in battle because your camera frustum was pointed in one direction, so you didn't have a good view of the battlefield. It was a challenge because we all wanted a fun strategy game. Eventually we pulled the camera into a more traditional isometric view, and that's when we really started making progress. But which 2D? Not all 2D games are the same. Two major styles have developed. Classic 2D, which is a straight top-down, chess checkers or side-on Sonic games view, or isometric 2D, which tries to fake 3D with an isometric projection at a single set angle. Before making the full jump to 3D, many genres made a move from classic 2D to isometric 2D as an intermediary step. For example, the original Civilization had a traditional top-down grid view, while Civ 2 had a three-quarter isometric view. While this new perspective gave the game world a more lifelike appearance, the change did come at the cost to the user's game experience. Namely, distances are much more difficult to judge in an isometric grid, as the east and west axis takes up twice as many pixels as the north and south axis. To solve this problem, for Civ 4 our 3D perspective actually harkened back to the original game, as we showed the game's grid straight ahead, but not at an angle. The easier the players perceive the grid through the graphics, the better they can see their possible decisions. It is significant that Advanced Wars Days of Ruin for the Nintendo DS, the latest version in this long-running series, has maintained the traditional chessboard view, keeping the player focus squarely on the core gameplay. The chunky unit art familiar to the series is a good example of an artistic style which flows from the limitation of the game's presentation. In contrast, a game heavily influenced by Advanced Wars series, Age of Empires: The Age of Kings for the Nintendo DS, chose to move the same game mechanics into an isometric 2D world. The transition was not altogether successful. Not only was the immediacy of the grid harder to follow, but because units extended beyond the edges of their tiles, selecting units and locations became a significant problem when groups of units overlapped one another. Thus, tile-based games tend to be more successful when a top-down view is adopted. Graphics are not gameplay. 3D graphics are not the same as 3D gameplay. For example, two sci-fi RTS games, Homeworld and Sins of a Solar Empire, use very familiar 3D engines to recreate the vast scale of special effects on deep space combat. However, they do not share the core gameplay, as Homeworld is a true 3D game, meaning that ships could be moved freely along the Z-axis, while Sins actually has 2D gameplay, as the game is played out on a single flat plane, meaning the ships cannot fly above or below each other. In fact, the game could have been implemented with a 2D engine, using 3D as a secondary choice to enable smooth zooming and to evoke the feel of outer space. The team's decision to adopt a 2D gameplay saved Sins from interface complications of Homeworld, which required 2 to 3 separate clicks to give units a destination on all 3 dimensions. Many other examples of hybrids exist, where games use 3D graphics to render essentially flat 2D gameplay. Super Smash Bros. Brawl, for example, is fought on a single vertical plane that uses a 3D engine for all of the important animations and fluid background environments. Cliff Bleszinski described the gameplay of Gears of War as a horizontal version of the classic platform Bionic Commando. Instead of using the grappling hook to ascend down a platform, Gears players jump from cover point to cover point along a horizontal plane. Essentially, most games can be divided into 3 gameplay mechanic categories, which are related to, but semi-independent of graphics. Tile-based games being 1, Tetris, Puzzle Quest, Civilization, Oasis, NetHack, etc. Real playing games being 2, StarCraft, Madden, Geometry Wars, and Super Mario Bros. For other examples. And lastly, real-world games, using the examples of Portal, Super Mario Galaxy, Burnout, and Boom Blocks. Good rules of thumb exist for each of these categories. Real-world games essentially require 3D graphics. Of course, the term real is not meant to be taken literally. The gun from Portal is not real, but the user enjoys playing with it because the expectation is that its unique behavior exists in harmony with the physics and graphics of our own world. The easiest way to guarantee that the player bring along assumptions from the real world is to immerse them in a 3D environment that looks, behaves, and feels real. These environments are the equivalent to what you see is what you get for games. On the other hand, tile-based games usually work best as 2D top-down games with little separating the player from the core game mechanics. For single-plane games, the choice comes down to largely one of aesthetics and technology. Can the game's platform support 3D graphics smoothly? Does 3D provide an advantage from either shared animations or dynamic effects or game general flexibility that makes the technology worthwhile? All in all, 2D is an underrated style that is often unfairly ignored as an old technology. Developers should not underestimate the advantages of avoiding the technical overhead of maintaining a bulky 3D engine and asset pipeline. Further, well-made 2D graphics are never really obsolete. Sulkaharo, lead designer of Habbo Hotel, likes to point out that their retro 2D style looks just as good today as when the game launched 8 years ago. If they had used 3D, Habbo would probably be on its second or third engine by now. Once a 2D game is up and running, the artist can focus on simply improving the game's overall look piece by piece. If 2D helps clarify and communicate the underlying game mechanic, then all the better. This concludes audio article number 48. Written by Soren Johnson and read aloud by Ryan Wianco on the 27th of December 2008. Once again, we definitely recommend that you head over to Soren's blog at www.designer-notes.com and make sure you keep up to date with all of the great insight that he puts up on that site regularly. We also definitely recommend that you check back to industrybroadcast.com frequently, as we're doing our best to update the site on a regular basis, bringing you the collective